In 2016, a small team of geneticists sequenced DNA from bones buried in the Zagros mountains of western Iran. The remains were nearly 10,000 years old. Nobody expected what they would find inside those ancient cells to rewrite one of the most cherished stories in human history, the story of where farming began and who invented it. But before we get to those bones, we need to talk about a question that sounds simple and turns out to be almost meaningless. What is American DNA and what is Iranian DNA? Because somewhere along the way, a lot of people started believing nations have genetic signatures, the way they have flags or anthems. That idea feels intuitive. It is also, according to nearly every population geneticist who has studied the question, false. And understanding why it's false is what leads us into one of the strangest scientific detective stories of the last decade. Let's start with the United States. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Katarzyna Brick analyzed genetic data from more than 160,000 people across the country, working with the consumer genetics company 23andMe. What they found wasn't a single American genome, it was a mosaic. Patterns of European, African, Indigenous American, and other ancestries that varied wildly depending on which state you were standing in, layered on top of centuries of migration, enslavement, colonization, and voluntary movement from nearly every continent on Earth. There is no genetic marker that says American. There's only a country built from thousands of different starting points. Any study claiming to compare American DNA to another nation's DNA as if each were a single population is, geneticists will tell you, working from a flawed premise before the first sample is even sequenced. So why does the idea persist? Why do so many people still imagine that nationality and ancestry line up neatly, that a country has a genetic identity the way a species has a genome? To answer that, we have to go back more than 2 centuries, to a mistake that started as a linguistic observation and ended up fueling some of the most destructive ideology of the 20th century. In the late 1700s, a British judge in colonial India named William Jones noticed something remarkable. Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, shared a strange number of similarities with Latin, Greek, and the Germanic languages of Europe. Words for numbers, for family relationships, for basic verbs, they lined up in ways that felt impossible to be coincidence. Jones proposed that all these languages descended from a common ancestral tongue, spoken by a people who had since vanished into history. Linguists later named that hypothetical language Proto-Indo-European, and the people who supposedly spoke it were given a label borrowed from ancient Sanskrit and Persian texts, Aryan. That word, in its original context, simply meant something like noble or of the community. It appears in the Rig Veda and in old Persian inscriptions as a term of cultural self-identification, nothing more. But over the following century, European scholars did something the ancient texts never intended. They took a linguistic category and turned it into a racial one. If Sanskrit, Persian, and European languages were all related, the reasoning went, then perhaps there had been an actual ancient race, tall, fair-skinned, superior, who had swept out of a homeland somewhere in Central Asia or the Eurasian steppe and civilized everyone from India to Ireland. It was a compelling story. It was also, historians and geneticists now agree, almost entirely invented. A linguistic pattern reimagined as a biological hierarchy, built to justify colonial and later genocidal ideology. The Nazi regime seized on this invented Aryan race and twisted it further, even as it misapplied the term to specifically exclude the very Iranian and South Asian peoples whose ancient language had given the word its name in the first place. Here's the strange irony that most people never learn. Modern-day Iran gets its name directly from this word. Iran derives from Aryan, Iran, land of the Aryans, a name adopted in antiquity by Persian-speaking peoples referring to their own shared linguistic and cultural heritage, long before European race theorists ever touched the term. So when someone today invokes Aryan as a racial category, they are, often unknowingly, borrowing a Persian and Sanskrit word for cultural belonging, and wearing it as something its ancient users never intended. For 100 years, this confusion sat there, tangled up in both scholarship and atrocity, waiting for actual biological evidence to sort out fact from fantasy. That evidence didn't arrive until the 21st century, and it came, quite literally, out of the ground beneath the Zagros Mountains. Ancient DNA analysis is a strange kind of science. It involves extracting genetic material from bones and teeth that have spent thousands of years underground, fighting against decay, contamination from soil bacteria, and the simple fact that DNA breaks down over time into shorter and shorter fragments. Researchers drill into the densest part of a skull, the petrous bone, where DNA tends to survive longest, extract a fine bone powder, and sequence whatever genetic fragments remain. Then they compare those fragments against reference genomes from populations around the world, looking for shared mutations that reveal ancestry, migration, and relatedness stretching back millennia. In 2016, a team led by archaeogeneticist Farnaz Brushaki and population geneticist Joachim Berger sequenced the genomes of early farmers from the Zagros region of western Iran, dating to roughly 10,000 years ago, right at the dawn of agriculture. Farming is often taught as though it emerged once in the Fertile Crescent and then simply spread outward like ripples from a single stone dropped in water. That's the story most textbooks still tell. The Zagros genomes told a different one. These ancient Iranian farmers, it turned out, were genetically distinct from the early farmers of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and from the farmers of the Levant, the region covering modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. All three groups had independently begun cultivating crops and domesticating animals at roughly the same time, in roughly the same broader region, yet their DNA showed they had been genetically separated for thousands of years beforehand, with surprisingly little interbreeding between them despite their geographic closeness. Agriculture, it seemed, hadn't spread from one inventive population to its neighbors. It had emerged in parallel among genetically distinct communities who may have shared ideas and techniques through contact and trade, without necessarily sharing much else. That alone would have been a remarkable enough finding to rewrite the opening chapter of civilization. But researchers weren't finished. The next question was where these Zagros hunter-gatherers turned farmers had come from, and where their descendants went. Genetic comparisons showed that this ancient Iranian population carried ancestry that looked strikingly different from the populations who would later become associated with the Great Bronze Age migrations across Eurasia. And that set up an even bigger puzzle, one that a massive 2019 study would try to solve. In September of that year, a team led by geneticist Vagish Narasimhan published one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever conducted on South and Central Asia, analyzing genetic data from over 500 ancient individuals spanning thousands of years. Their goal was to finally test, with hard genetic evidence, whether the old Aryan invasion story, the idea of a single ancient population sweeping from a shared homeland into both Europe and India, held up. The results were more complicated and more interesting than either side of the old debate had imagined. The study found genuine evidence of steppe-related ancestry, genetic signatures tracing back to pastoralist populations of the Eurasian grasslands north of the Caucasus, appearing in ancient South Asian genomes, arriving in distinct waves beginning around 2000 BCE. But this steppe ancestry didn't sweep in and replace existing populations. It blended, gradually and unevenly, into communities that already carried deep, ancient roots, tracing back to those very same Iranian-related farming populations Brushaki's team had identified years earlier, alongside separate ancestral lineages already present in South Asia for millennia before any steppe migration occurred. In other words, the genetic story of the region wasn't one population arriving to civilize another. It was layer upon layer of mixture, migration, and coexistence, stretching back over 10,000 years, with the ancient Iranian plateau sitting at one of the most important crossroads in the entire story. Here's where the findings get genuinely surprising, even to specialists. Modern Iranian populations, it turns out, are not simple, direct descendants of either those ancient Zagros farmers or the later steppe migrants alone. Like nearly every population geneticists have studied anywhere on Earth, modern Iranians carry a complex blend of ancestries accumulated over thousands of years of migration, conquest, trade, and intermarriage, including that deep Zagros farmer ancestry, later steppe-related input, and additional contributions from surrounding regions across the long history of empires that rose and fell across the Iranian plateau, from the Achaemenids to the Sassanids to the Islamic conquests and beyond. There is no genetically pure ancient Persian population waiting to be uncovered, any more than there's a genetically pure American one. Every population geneticists have ever sequenced turns out to be a mixture once you look closely enough. The deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to find any human population that hasn't been shaped by repeated waves of migration and mixing. This is where the two halves of our story finally meet. The 19th century fantasy of a single, superior Aryan race sweeping out of a homeland to father both European and Iranian civilizations doesn't survive contact with the ancient DNA. The real picture is far messier and honestly far more interesting. Independent agricultural origins in genetically distinct populations, gradual and repeated mixing across thousands of years, steppe ancestry arriving in complicated, uneven pulses rather than a single triumphant migration, and modern populations everywhere, from Tehran to Toledo, Ohio, representing accumulated layers of history rather than any kind of genetic essence. So what happens if you actually run the comparison implied by our starting question? Genetic data from people who identify as American against genetic data from people who identify as Iranian. Population geneticists have, in a sense, already done versions of this work, not to produce a headline, but to map human ancestry more broadly. Studies of global genetic variation, including major projects like the Human Genome Diversity Project and the 1000 Genomes Project, consistently show that the genetic differences within any single national population dwarf the average differences between national populations. An Iranian American in Los Angeles may share more relevant ancestry with a next-door neighbor of Italian descent than with a randomly selected person from rural Iran. A person born in Isfahan may share more with a resident of Tbilisi or Yerevan than with another Iranian born 1,000 kilometers away in Baluchistan. Nations are political categories. DNA doesn't recognize borders drawn in the last few centuries. It only recognizes ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years, long before Iran or the United States existed as concepts at all. That's the twist hiding inside our opening question. There was never going to be a single shocking number, a percentage that neatly separated American from Iranian DNA, because both categories are far too genetically diverse internally to produce one. The real shock, if there is one, is how thoroughly modern genetics has dismantled the older idea that nations, races, or ethnic groups carry distinct, bounded genetic identities at all. Every population scientists have studied turns out to be a patchwork, and the deeper the ancient DNA record goes, the more patchwork it reveals, all the way back to those farmers in the Zagros Mountains, independently inventing agriculture 10,000 years ago, unaware that their bones would one day help settle an argument about race and identity that wouldn't even exist for another 9,000 years. There remain real, open questions in this field. Researchers still debate the exact timing and number of migration waves into South Asia, the precise homeland and expansion routes of Proto-Indo-European speakers, and how cultural and linguistic spread relates to genetic mixture, since language and genes don't always travel together in lockstep. These are active, ongoing areas of research, not settled certainties, and any documentary that tells you otherwise is overselling the evidence. What is well established, repeatedly confirmed across multiple independent studies and labs, is the core finding that dismantles the old myth. There was no single ancient master race, no pure bloodline running unbroken from a mythical homeland into modern nations. There was migration, mixture, adaptation, and time, the same forces that shaped every human population on Earth, including the one you belong to. What makes this story so extraordinary isn't just what it reveals about 10,000-year-old farmers in the Zagros Mountains, or about the accidental birth of a racist myth from a misread linguistic pattern. It's what it suggests about the questions we're still asking today, the ones dressed up in modern language like American DNA versus Iranian DNA, as if identity were something written in our cells rather than something built, layer by layer, generation by generation, out of every migration and mixture that came before us. The bones in the ground never cared about the borders we'd eventually draw over them. Maybe that's the real discovery worth sitting with,